In this lesson, we are going to talk about the two first European civilizations, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. These civilizations were contemporary with the Hittites, the Egyptians, and I think it's the early part of the Assyrian state. And they are very important because they laid the foundations of what will later become Greek civilization, which is the foundation of the West, the foundation of Western civilization. The Minoans developed between 2600 and 1400 BC. And I want you to always, I never ask dates. I want to give you a sense of how old things are, because the problem is that dates keep being revised. So right now we have this figure, I'm sorry, this range. The 1400 is pretty much correct. The 2600, that's the problematic date, because with all civilizations, the more we discover, the more we analyze information, the more, uh, in this case, the more science we have to analyze the remnants of civilizations. Uh, Very often we keep pushing back the early dates. So when I say that this civilization developed between 2600 and 1400 BC, it means that by the year 2600 BC, there is clear evidence of these people are there with a certain level of culture, with a certain level of development. Most likely, it started earlier than that. Uh, the islands of the Aegean are going to be inhabited very early on, and there is ample evidence of that. And right here, we see the Minoan world. You see that the Aegean Sea, which is dotted with many islands, and one of the first cultures that appears is called the uh, Cycladic culture. The Cyclades or Cycladic Islands have provided us with a big, a large number of artifacts that give us a sense of those early cultures that settled there. They are farmers. Obviously, they know how to navigate because they live on islands, and therefore they're also fishermen, and they also trade. And that is something that is going to characterize these civilizations, the ability to travel by sea. The Cycladic civilization also has a very peculiar aesthetics in terms of the art that they produce. So, are these people connected to the Minoans? Probably. We don't know, but definitely the Minoans are in that general area. The Minoan civilization was born and developed on the island of Crete. It is the largest island in the Aegean, one of the largest islands in the Mediterranean. And as you can see, it is very long, but it's narrow, relatively narrow. This island is it has a lot of microclimates. So depending on where you are, what side of the island, what altitude, the climate is quite different, but it has a lot of resources. And that means that when the early humans settled there, they were able to create a culture and then a civilization that was well provided for. You have agriculture, you have shepherding, and of course, you have the sea, which provides a lot of nutrition for the people. Right here, we see an image of the landscape of Crete. As you can see, it is a very mountainous area. It is there are several mountain ranges, and that means, as I said before, that these mountain ranges creates a micro climate. They create microclimates in several uh, regions. What is interesting about this is that usually when you see, especially an island that is very mountainous, very often you see the development of very distinct cultural groups. Sometimes even distinct languages. I'll give you the example of New Guinea. New Guinea is actually a much larger island. It's on the between Asia and the Pacific. in New Guinea, in the, I would say, in the mid 20th century, when they started to explore more, they discovered that there were 800 languages spoken. Uh, that's because the mountains separated people, and very often there was little communication. That's, of course, an extreme. But in general, when you see island societies, large islands with a lot of mountains, very often you will see that there are political and cultural divisions, and very often linguistic divisions. We do not see that in Crete, as far as we know. So what is interesting is that you have a uniform culture and very likely a uniform language in spite of the mountainous terrain. So you look at this, and it's a beautiful island. It's in the Mediterranean. You can cultivate wheat and all kinds of grains. It is good for cattle because there are in the valleys there is grasslands that are perfect for cattle, and we know that there are a lot of semi-domesticated aurochs that eventually became actually cattle and bulls through domestication. We know that they had goats and sheep, and of course, there's the cultivation of grapes and olives, which leads to the production of wine and the production of olive oil. So you can imagine the diet of these early Cretans was uh, meat, milk, cheese, uh, fish, bread, olive oil, and wine. Sounds like a pretty good diet, if you ask me, and actually a healthy diet. The landscape, in this case, is not going to be a deterrent for the creation of a uniform culture and a uniform political system. The archaeologist who discovered and identified the Minoans as a new civilization was called Arthur Evans. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a lot of interest in discovering the uh, ancestral civilization of the Greeks. And starting with a fellow by the name of Schliemann, uh, European scholars, and in the case of Schliemann, also an adventurer, are starting to dig in different places looking for physical evidence of things that we only knew from either historical texts from ancient times or from literature. So perhaps you have heard about the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are the first great works of literature in the Greek language. And these two works, while they are fiction, they are based on very, very, how I said it, very freely, they are based on something that was historical. And they do portray a type of society that did not exist once Greece became a historically known culture and civilization. So people like Schliemann um, are going to read the Iliad and the Odyssey. These two, and the Iliad is the book about the war on Troy, and probably you've heard about the Trojan horse. The Odyssey is the story of Odysseus, who is going back home, and he goes through all kinds of adventures. So, based on those books, Schliemann is going to locate uh, the place where ancient Troy was located, and it's a great accomplishment. Of course, very controversial because Schliemann did some things that were not right from the archaeological point of view. Nonetheless, it inspired other people to say, maybe if we dig in other places, we will find evidence of these earlier civilizations before the Greeks. So Evans went to the island of Crete and he discovered this. This is the palace of Knossos. Knossos, by the way, Knossos is not the name of that capital in those days. We don't know what the place was called. Knossos was the center of Minoan civilization. And actually, we don't know what the Minoans called themselves. The term Minoan was created by Evans. And the reason is that in Greek mythology, there is the story of uh, King Minos. And if you watch the documentary that is part of this section of the course, you will see You will hear the story of King Minos and the connection of that to the ancient people of Crete. So Evans takes this name and says they are the Minoans. We know that the Egyptians knew these people and they called them the Keftu. So we don't know whether Keftu is the actual name of these people or that's just the name that the Egyptians gave them. Whatever the term is, the term Minoans stuck. Now, what you see here, this is not what Evans found, of course. He found ruins, and based on that, uh, historical artists have recreated what seems to have been the palace of Knossos. This is actually what the palace looks like today from the inside in some cases. Very peculiar architecture. It doesn't look like anything else. It doesn't look like classical Greek architecture. It doesn't look like Egyptian architecture or Middle Eastern architecture. So there is a peculiar character of these people. And that's usually the case with people who live on islands. They develop their own culture, but also their own uh, view of the world and their own sense of aesthetics, their own sense of what is beautiful. This is the throne room, and this is what Evans called it because if you see to the right, there is uh, a chair. He called it a throne. Is it a throne? Maybe we don't know. Quite possibly. There's a lot of things that we don't know about this civilization, but you can get a sense of these spaces that are created. And of course, what you can notice is that the walls are painted. The whole palace was decorated from the inside and the outside. And this is something that I think is worth mentioning when we look at ruins from the past, whether it's the Minoans or the Middle Eastern civilizations, Greece or Rome, we imagine them as the buildings as brown, the naked stone with its own natural colors. When we think of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, we think of white marble, these pristinely white cities. That's not the case. Ancient peoples love color and the most of the buildings were painted in Greece, in Rome, even in Mesopotamia. Very often things were painted. Also, sometimes they would also whitewash them, so they were pretty white. And so, but in general, especially when we talk about palaces or buildings that are publicly important, decoration was very important. So, in the case of the Minoans, we see a nicely painted room, and here we see a Minoan fresco. A fresco is a peculiar form of painting. And what you do is that there's a wall, and then on the wall, you put plaster. And then you even it out. While the plaster is still fresh, you paint what you want to paint. And the reason is that if you wait until the plaster is dry and you paint, it will peel off sometimes within days. Of course, certainly within months and years. So what they did is that while the plaster was still fresh, they would paint it so that it would absorb the paint, and that's how it has lasted. What 4,500 years. That is how old that painting is. And what you see in this painting is something that is represented a lot in Minoan art. Uh, it's a bull. Now these bulls are huge. They're not your like average bull of today. They're pretty big because the cattle had recently, relatively speaking, been domesticated. So these are the close descendants of the aurochs. The aurochs is the ancestor of all cows. Huge animal. And of course, bulls are very aggressive. And what you see here are, I guess, athletes holding the bull by the horns, jumping on top of it. These appears everywhere in the art, in sculptures, in paintings, in pottery. So it seems that this jumping of the bull, if you want to call it that, was part of a ceremony that may have been very important. Not may have been, was definitely very important for the Minoans. What was the significance? All kinds of speculation about that. Is it a sport? Not quite. There's no such thing as sports in the sense that we um, we know them today in ancient times. There were definitely athletic competitions, but very often they were linked to religion, religious cults, religious festivals. So these athletes, by the way, both men and women who would jump on top of the bull, were probably trained to make special offerings to a god, possibly. But as you can see, there's a lot of skill involved and, of course, very dangerous. And here we have another Minoan fresco. This one is of three ladies. As you can see, they have very fancy dresses. They have very elaborate head arrangements with diadems. Uh, are they dancers? Are they women from the upper classes? That's not clear. They appear dressed in this. By the way, their dresses were really nice. They had ruffles, and very often we don't know whether this is an artistic thing that all the women appear with this almost like a corset, but showing their breasts. We don't know whether this is the actual fashion of Minoan women, or in this case, they are depicted that because breasts are very often symbols of fertility. Uh, but we get a sense that these women were very elaborately dressed. When Evans discovered these paintings, he actually saw them as that there was some familiarity. That if he looked at these women, looked at the faces, they kind of looked like the Europeans of his day, and that led him to say that the Minoans were the first civilization in Europe, and he's right about that. Now, where did the Minoans come from? That's the big question, right? We don't know. We don't know what the ethnicity of the Minoans was. Are they Indo-European? Uh, People doubt that because of the dates in which Crete was settled, but there's a possibility. Are they related to the first people who lived in Greece prior to the arrival of the Greeks? Possibly. Uh, but we know how they look because these paintings give us a glimpse of that. This fresco is interesting because this is the representation of a mythological figure. We don't know what the Minoans call it, but in Greek civilization, these creatures came to be known as griffins. A griffin is a combination of a lion and a bird, has the body of a lion and the head of a bird. And what is interesting about this is that there is seems to be a continuity, even in terms of some of the aesthetic and mythological images that you see in Minoan art. Some of them reappear in the art of the Greeks later on. So even we don't know whether the Minoans were Greek or not, but definitely they have a connection to the culture that comes afterward. And that's very important to keep in mind that the Minoans were not circumscribed to Crete. The whole culture of the islands around Crete and the other islands on the Aegean is connected to the Cretans. The people of Crete, the Minoans, they were great traders. They traded with Egypt, they traded with Cyprus, with the Hittites, with very, we would know that they traded with the Phoenicians. So in through this trade, their civilization had an impact on the other cultures of that area, and definitely they had an impact on the culture and civilization of the mainland of Greece. And that's the importance of art because art is, aside from being beautiful, aside from having aesthetic value, allows us to sometimes make connections and see continuity among different cultures, among different civilizations. And right here we have this image which is actually quite small, and that is the image of, we don't know, either a goddess or a priestess. As you can see, she's dressed with those fancy dresses that they wore, that corset displaying her breasts as obviously a sign of beauty and fertility. And then she has this, it's almost like a skirt on top of a skirt on top of a skirt type of garment. And she has a headdress, and then she's holding two snakes. Snakes were very often considered uh, sacred animals representing the forces of nature. There's a lot of speculation about the religion of the ancient Minoans. Uh, we believe that this goddess and others that appear like this are often fertility figures. A lot of agricultural societies center their cult around that. And while while we assume that the Cretans had armies, it's hard to believe that they didn't. The fact that these goddesses appear a lot says something about the nature of this civilization, because civilizations that are constantly at war, civilizations that are in essence warrior civilizations, usually have gods. They have fertility goddesses. Everyone has fertility goddesses. But if you are a warrior civilization, the main divine figures are usually gods of war, and not these female figures that represent fertility. So speculation is that this Minoan society was peaceful and therefore dedicated to uh, this cult of a goddess that would provide fertility to the land. One of the things that makes us think that also is that we, and by that I mean archaeologists, have not found evidence of fortifications in any of the cities on the island at that period. So what does that mean? If there are no fortifications, does it mean that they are just peaceful people who get along? Or does it mean that one city dominated everyone else and therefore there was no need for cities? It's hard to tell. A lot of this is, of course, speculation because we don't have any written evidence about the Minoans. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. We have written evidence, but we don't know how to read it. The Minoans developed first a hieroglyphic system of writing. You see samples of this in this artifact. This is known as the proto-syllabic hieroglyphic, Cretan hieroglyphic writing that was proto-syllabic, developed around 2000 BC. And what you see is these different images that in some cases represent sounds, but mostly represent concepts. And very often, each symbol represents a syllable. By the year 1700, Cretan hieroglyphic has developed further. And here you see a jasper, green jasper, seal jasper is a stone. And basically these things were used to make an imprint on official documents that were written on clay tablets to know that they were official. Some of these seals, of course, are mini beautiful works of art. Look at these two. One is made of carnelian, which is a semi-precious stone, reddish. The other one is agate. And you can see that you have a human figure with what? A bull. And in the other one, what you see are horses with pulling a chariot. These seals, again, would be used by kings or royal officials or perhaps priestly officials to imprint into a tablet, symbolizing that this is an official document. These are from around 1400 BC. And here we see that from the hieroglyphic system, the Minoans evolved into something called Linear A, which is a purely syllabic system. We don't know whether this comes from the other or they were evolving parallel to each other, probably a combination of both. But even by 1700, while there are some hieroglyphic artifacts, there's already this. It's called Linear A. Why is it called Linear A? Because it's written in lines. Unlike Middle Eastern languages, cuneiform, where everything is written in a vertical form, that's also the case for many of the Chinese forms of writing. The Minoans use linear, and that might be the reason why we still use a linear way of writing. Unfortunately, we have not been able to decipher this language. this is one of the few writing systems in history that have that for uh, for which evidence has survived that we have been unable to decipher. Remember that every language that was spoken in the Middle East in ancient times and was written has now been deciphered. Sumerian, Akkadian, Gutian, Elamite, Urartian, Ugaritic, Assyrian, all of those, Egyptian, obviously. But this one has defied the efforts of epigraphers to figure out. And this is a big problem because as long as we cannot decipher this, we do not know what language the Cretans spoke. And we don't know the language, we cannot know their ethnic affiliations or origins. So whoever eventually deciphers this is going to be a tremendous accomplishment because we will be able to know much more about the people of Crete. We assume that most of these tablets, however, are not really historical in the sense that they're not accounts or chronicles. Most of these tablets are most likely, uh, uh, I would say, accounting tools, inventories of things. They were used mainly for administrative purposes. But there's no doubt that some of them may contain some actual explicit historical evidence. Uh, so hopefully in the future we will know. So what happened to the Minoans? We know that sometime around the year 1600, and there's some controversy and debate about the dates of this, but by most agreement, sometime between 1642 and 1540, on the island of Thera, on the Mediterranean, there was a huge explosion. Thera is basically a volcanic island, and this explosion, which is similar to what happened in Krakatoa in the 19th century in Indonesia, or even Mount St. Helen in the United States several decades back, it's a gigantic explosion that did two things. First, it created a giant tsunami that probably destroyed a lot of the coastal towns of Crete. And the other thing is that the explosion threw out ashes that affected the climate of the earth. And of course, these ashes uh, landed also on the soil of Crete. Today, by the way, when you see that those edges and around the water, that's actually the crater of the volcano. And today, this island is called Santorini, and it's a huge tourist attraction spot. It's beautiful. It's filled with these whitewashed houses on the mountains, on the hills, and of course, the harbor is filled with yachts from the super rich. Uh, but this is responsible for a huge catastrophe 3,500 years ago. Was that the cause for the decline of Crete? Yes and no. It was one of the causes. Um, in history, it is very rare to find one thing as the cause of a huge event. The causes of the rise and fall of empires or civilizations are quite complex. But definitely this must have an effect because it's not only that the cities of the coast were devastated, and there's evidence about that, but also that the ashes destroyed the crops and probably had an altering effect on the climate for a few years. And that means that without agricultural production, there must have been famine and eventually death. There's also evidence that there was at one point, perhaps a civil war. And the reason for that is that uh, in a lot of the towns around Crete, you see evidence of burning, of destruction, but not in Knossos. So is it that Knossos face a revolt and crush it by destroying the cities? Maybe. But there's evidence that something was going on within Crete. And of course, on top of all of this, and that's usually what happens in history, things pile up. Eventually, Crete came under the control of the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were people from the mainland of Greece. And during the last period of life on Crete, the Mycenaeans most likely ruled the island. And that is just before the crisis of the first millennium, right? This is when the sea peoples eventually disrupted the whole balance of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Crete was affected by that too, and became part of what we call the Dark Ages of Greek history. The other civilization that is contemporaneous with the Minoans and eventually is going to have an important role uh, in the decline and fall of the former is the Mycenaean civilization. They developed between 1900 and 1200 BC. The Mycenaeans are the first Greek civilization, uh, and they represent the foundation to what Greek civilization become later. And actually, their history will become, in some cases, the subject of legends that will reappear during the time of classical Greece. So the Mycenaean world is centered on the southern part of the Balkan Peninsula, what today is modern Greece. And as you can see, that world is also very close and connected to the world of the Aegean Islands, and also very close to Crete, the island of the Minoans. The Mycenaeans are not natives. They came from somewhere, obviously from the north. They either replaced or mixed with the people who already lived there, who were farmers. So, sometime around the year 2000 BC, we start to see these migrations. And remember, when we say migrations in ancient times, very often these migrations are accompanied with violence, or sometimes, not always, but very often, there is a violence encounter between different cultures. And the Mycenaeans are going to build cities all around, and many of the cities will survive into the period of classical Greece, others will not. In this illustration, we see what the city of Mycenae would have looked like around 1300 BC. Mycenae is perhaps the most important of the Mycenaean cities, and actually, that's what we call these people the Mycenaeans, because this was probably the center of that culture, of that civilization. When you look at this, the first of all, the location is in a mountainous area, and what is the most prominent feature of this is the walls. They have very thick walls protecting the area where people lived, and up in the center you see something that is, in all likelihood, a palace, along with temples. I mentioned before that one of the interesting features about Knossos in Crete and the other cities in the on the island of Crete is that they didn't have protective walls. And the two possibilities are that people were very peaceful, or that Crete was ruled only by one king and therefore didn't need walls. The latter is most likely the answer. Here, obviously, there are walls. And what is the reason for having walls? Well, because you have enemies. And this, in a sense, is something that defines the Mycenaeans. That, of course, they're farmers, of course, they are craftsmen, of course, they have the ability to produce many elements of culture, but they're primarily a warrior civilization. And you can see it um, in their construction. Right here, this is what Mycenae looks like today. The Lion Gate, that is very likely the main entrance. And now it looks dilapidated, and you don't really get a sense of how powerful this image was as you were approaching this. The two lions are a symbol of power, and that's what you want to project. And of course, look at the massive stones that are used to build these defensive walls. So what we gather from this is that this is a society that is at war. That war is one of the constant elements in the life of these cities. And what that means is that there was never a Mycenaean, there was a Mycenaean king, of course, but there was not a Mycenaean kingdom as a territorial state. Each city was most likely independent. Each city most likely controlled just a limited area around them. And in some cases, they were allies. In some cases, they went to war against each other. And we see that in a lot of the archaeological evidence that we find uh, in the archaeological record. So right here we see a Mycenaean dagger from around 13 BC, made of bronze. So they are a civilization during the Bronze Age. And as you can see, it is time has not been kind to this, but you can still see that it's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. It involves a lot of man hours to produce, of course. So the people who produced these weapons were very valuable and very valued by these societies. And this is really interesting. This is an example of Mycenaean armor. As you can see, well, it's also made of bronze, so it has to be very heavy. But the interesting thing about it is that it's articulated. You see that it has like this little concentric layers of bronze, and the shoulders are also not fixed. They are attached through holes, and well, today they have put wire. In those days, it was probably with rope. It protects your full upper body, right, and actually all the way down to your thighs. It protects your neck and even your chin, right? It goes all the way up. So it was probably very uncomfortable to wear, but it offered a lot of protection. When you put so much work, can you imagine how difficult it was to produce just one set of this armor? So this is not just something that is useful to go into combat. This is also something that reflects status symbol. And if you see the helmet is interesting. Look at this. This is a helmet. The helmet is basically a round piece made of bronze. But on top of the helmet, what you have is this white little things. What do you think those things are? They are actually pieces of tusk of wild boar. You know, wild boars, those wild pigs, they have these big tusks, and that's what you have there. So, what is the meaning of something like this? First of all, how many wild boars had to die for someone to wear this? Many. And of course, there's no. It's not like you go to a shop and say, you know, can I have some wild boar tusks to make a helmet? No. What this means is that the man who's wearing this killed all of those wild boars. And when he has this helmet displaying that, it is a symbol of manhood, it is a symbol of his prowess as a warrior. So when you see objects like this is what tells you that this is definitely a warrior society. The values of this society are reflected in the care and the time consuming crafts that involve the production of weaponry and protection armor. And here we see a Mycenaean shield. This is called an 8 shaped shield for obvious reasons. It looks like a number 8. It is made with the hide of a cow that is being, it's either wood with hides and it's reinforced in that way. It's not the best type of shield, but it does offer a significant measure of protection. And the shape of the shield in that and number 8 allows you to have protection of the upper body, protection of the lower body, and the ability to manipulate it. And that's why it's narrow in the. That's where you're holding the shield. So these shields appear in many representations, especially in pottery. A lot of these objects come from a tholos. The tholos is the typical tomb of a Mycenaean warrior. As you can see, it is built as a round space, and then it is covered with soil, but not all of them. This is something that was found in a tholos. It's called the Mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is a king from the Iliad and from other mythological accounts, also from Greek drama. So this was found in a tomb. It's actually it's like a wafer thin uh, sheet of gold that was placed on top of the face of most likely the dead warrior, and to to immortalize his face, and it's a funerary mask. Beautiful, beautiful work of art, and it's almost you can see that it is the portrayal of a person. Of course, we don't know who the person was. It's called the Mask of Agamemnon because remember Evans and Schliemann and all of those archaeologists from the 19th and early 20th century, they were fascinated with the mythology and the literature of ancient Greece. And when they found things, they often connected them to that. But there's no proof that this belonged to Agamemnon, who, according to legend, was the king of he was a Mycenaean king, uh, but we don't know who this person was. But you get a sense of the craftsmanship of these uh, artisans. So this is what a tholos actually looks like. And if you look at the people there, so you get a sense of how big they are. These are there are different sizes, but a lot of them are like this. Very, very impressive structures. So the tholos are tombs for whom? For warriors, for kings, for members of this elite warrior class. And inside this tholos, the warrior would be buried with a lot of precious possessions, uh, weapons, gold, chariots. Unfortunately, because they are pretty obvious, it's not difficult to find them. Over the course of the years, the tholos have been pillaged, not only in modern times, throughout history. So most of them have been found empty. And in this image, we see two beautiful, masterful pieces of Mycenaean pottery. Pottery was produced obviously for practical reasons, but they also became expressions of the artistic sensibility of these civilizations. And these two are really interesting because if you look at the one on the left, you can see that it is a depiction of chariots. You see one there with a horse, and the chariot has these big wheels that have four spokes. So they're actually very light, which tells you that these were very fast chariots. And it has there are two individuals on the chariot. One is the driver. The other one is the one who is throwing javelins at the enemy. The one who's throwing the javelins is the one that probably has a higher status than the one who's driving. And it shows that the Mycenaeans have adopted this uh, military technology, uh, obviously connected with the Indo-European migrations. The figure, the pottery piece to the right, that one is even more interesting because what you see on the right of the piece of pottery is another chariot with two warriors, and of course the typical big light weight wheel. But look at the animal that is hauling the chariot. It's a griffin. It is this mythological being that we saw in the uh, portrayed in Minoan art. And this is what I was talking about in terms of cultural continuity, right? That things that appear in one culture are eventually filtered through another one. And in this case, the griffin is portrayed in something that makes sense to the Mycenaeans. When we looked at the griffin in the walls of the palace at Knossos for the Mycenaeans, it is a beautiful mythological beast. If you remember, it has like a very nice, like the head is nicely decorated. Here, The griffin is put in a context that makes sense to the Mycenaeans, which is what? A military context. They are a warrior society. So for them, the image of the griffin makes sense as this mythical animal that is pulling a chariot with two warriors on board. And then next to the other figure is interesting because it's kind of a griffin, but it's more like a man bird, right? It's standing on two legs, and the head and the is the same, and it has wings, but it's a different type of being. So we don't know exactly what that represents, but sometimes you look at an object and it tells you a lot about the people who produced it. We are very lucky because we have written evidence of the Mycenaeans. They produce a type of writing known as Linear B. Why Linear B? Because the people of Crete had Linear A. As I said before, we have not been able to decipher Linear A. Fortunately, Linear B has been deciphered. It was probably developed around 1400, 1450 BC. And as you can see right here, it is right. It is written in the form of lines, not columns. And obviously, it was inspired by Linear A. Here we see another sample of Linear B. And these are perhaps some of these are tokens that give you the information about what was produced by a particular person in a particular field, information about how many, what the number of animals in a flock is, what a temple possesses, the harvest of a year, etc., etc. The person who deciphered Linear B was a man by the name of Michael Ventris. The significance of this is tremendous. Not only can we know what these people were writing in their own words, but what he discovered by deciphering Linear B is that the language of the Mycenaeans was an early form of Greek. That is, the Mycenaeans were Greeks. It's not the Greek of Plato or Aristotle, but it is Greek. And that's quite significant because we now see that there will be a continuity between these Mycenaean people and what comes later. So what happened to the Mycenaeans? Well, we know that they invaded Crete and they controlled Crete after the year 1400 BC. And then the crisis of the first millennium. This is when all the major empires of the Eastern Mediterranean collapse. And the Mycenaeans are not the either collapse or they were or decline. The Mycenaeans are no exception to this. It's hard to see because this is a small image, but you see all of those little red little things, those are flames. And what that shows is the location of cities that existed in that area around between 1200 and 800 BC, and these places were burnt. So virtually all the major urban centers, all the cities that existed both along the Asia Minor side and in Greece itself, between these this 400 within these 400 years, they were all at one point burned to the ground, which means that this is a time of invasions. These are violent times, and this is what we call the Greek Dark Ages. Invaders from the north uh, eventually destroyed the cities of Mycenae and Argos and all of those centers. Who are these invaders? Most likely other Greeks who eventually displaced the old ones and created their own civilization. In some cases, there may have been other groups, most likely Europeans, who just came in, destroyed, and passed through and moved on. So we don't know. And they're called the Dark Ages first because there is a decline, if not a complete collapse of civilization. But they're also the Dark Ages because we know relatively little about what's going on in this period. A lot of what we know only comes from archaeology, and most of it says that the cities were burned and destroyed. A lot of what we know also comes from uh, literature and mythology. So while it does offer a picture and hints of what was going on, it is not exactly history. And this means that this is the end of the Mycenaeans. The disruption is tremendous. A lot of the uh, political and social and structures and cultural traditions uh, that had been developed by the Minoans and the Mycenaeans disappear. One example is that uh, by the year 900 BC, there is no writing because people who knew how to write linear A or linear B uh, most likely died, were killed, and were unable to pass on that knowledge. So that knowledge disappears. When the Greeks reemerge from history, they're going to adopt the Phoenician alphabet because they didn't have a writing system there. So it is a very disruptive period, but out of the ashes, literally, uh, a new civilization is going to emerge. So the metaphor of the phoenix would be in place, right? The phoenix, according to legend, according to mythology, is a bird that burns, and out of his ashes he is reborn. So this is what will happen to Greek civilization. It will be reborn or born out of the ashes that were left of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans.